Alright, so this is the end result of Cookie Party. Essentially, there's a cookie jar, there's Cookie Monster, and you're trying to feed Cookie Monster until he is full. So I can specify what types of cookies to generate within the plate here, and then I can click cookie, and then it'll generate here. I'm gonna click snickerdoodles, and it generates snickerdoodle cookies, fudge cookies, broccoli, M&M, and then lastly burnt cookies. And then it's got to generate in the plate here, and then when I click on it, it's got to fill Cookie Monster up, depending on the cookie. Like let's say he wants to eat a broccoli cookie, it actually decreases his full meter. A burnt cookie also does that. There's fudge, and it just fills it up. And so that's what we're trying to achieve. Alright, to start Cookie Party, we're just gotta explain the setup. You navigate to your REPL it, and then I'm going to add another REPL. I'm gonna import from GitHub and say truong/cookie-party. And I'm gonna import that repo from GitHub. Alright, it's just been loaded. I'm just gonna give you a quick rundown of what's actually here in this repo. You have your index.html, which is currently empty. I'm going to obviously walk you through how to do the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You have images of what you had seen before. These are the cookies, and then we have the monster, and then title, which you don't really need, and then success, which is a challenge option for the challenge option. And if we navigate to screenshot, we have the screenshots of what the end product looks like. Just two different screenshots separately. We have a cookie-party JavaScript file with instructions and variables that we'll be using. We have a helper function JavaScript file that you guys can use, but I'm just going to use document.getElementById or query selector throughout. But these are just here if you find it tedious to continue to use to write all of this code down. We have this helper function here called calculate hunger, which you're going to use in the cookie-party JavaScript file. And then lastly, we have the style.css, containing a lot of the kind of background styling of just the overall product at the end. So let's get started. Let's navigate to our index.html, and we'll get started with actually creating the content of this application. So starting the HTML code, navigate to your index.html page. We're going to start the index.html page by quickly doing kind of like the backbone of any HTML page in general. We're going to define the doc type, and then do an opening and closing HTML tag, have a header tag, a head tag, which again describes the metadata of the website and not the actual content, and then the body, which is the actual content of the web page. And then I'm just going to define quickly a title as well as a meta tag containing the author. And again, the title is what shows up in the tabs here. As you can see, right now it says cookie-party. This is known as the title. But here we're going to say the title is Cookie Party. And then I'm going to describe some metadata. So I'm going to name it author. And then the content, which is the author, is my name. Make sure to place your name there. And then now we can get started. Let's first check if it runs properly. Well, nothing is there, but that's because we didn't put anything in the body. So navigating to the screenshot, let's double check what we need to actually create. So, or what the specific content of this HTML page is. So there's a header, a p tag, it seems like, that's the instructions, a drop-down menu, an image of the cookie jar. It seems like this empty space, which is a div, a meter, which indicates the hunger of the monster, and then an image of the monster. So, to kind of translate that into HTML, I'm just gonna use a header tag, which basically sections off a specific chunk of code as the header. So I'm gonna call this cookie party which one, so I'm declaring header 1 or a head 1 tag, and then I'm going to specify the instructions, which looks like it says instructions: feed Cookie Monster until he is full, different cookies fill up Cookie Monster in different ways. So I'm just gonna copy that there. Instructions. Let me double check again. Feed Cookie Monster until he is full. Different cookies fill up Cookie Monster in different ways. Alright. Another thing I'm gonna add to this p tag is a span tag, because you kind of notice in the screenshot that it's bolded, and so I want to have that bolded. Go back. I'm gonna specify a span tag that's just specifically for the instructions. And so you might be confused, oh, okay, what is a span tag? Well, similar to a div, it's for inline elements, and if you're kind of confused on what inline versus block, just know that inline elements always do not start a new line in the web page, versus divs do, because they're considered block, or take up the entire vertical length of the HTML page. And so I'm just gonna give this a class of bold, so we know, so we can kind of code that class in this style.css file, but we do have that defined here because we want this specific section to be called instructions. This has got to be the content inside the span tag, and this entire here has got to be the content inside the p tag. So if I were to press run, as you can see, it does generate here. And then so the next step is just creating the main content, which is the cookie jar, the plate, and then the actual like monster section. So let's start with that. I'm just going to use a section tag to define the jar section. So I'm going to say jar section, and then have a closing tag. I'm going to, instead of a p tag, I'm going to use a label, because a label is more semantically correct. Semantically meaning it actually tells the purpose of what this text is. It's a label for the drop-down menu. And so I'm going to say cookie type. And then I'm going to say select, which is going to start the drop-down menu. But we actually have to specify the contents, which we'll actually define in JavaScript, which is essentially we're going to generate the options tag through JavaScript. And then I'm going to define the image that has the cookie jar. So if I were to declare an image, I would use the img tag and define its source. So it looks like the cookie jar is here. So to remember to correctly define the pathway of the image, and remember a pathway is essentially from the index.html file, how do I navigate to this file called cookie-jar.png? Well, based on that, from the index.html, I say, okay, it's in the image tag, slash to indicate go into the image tab folder, and then say it's cookie-jar.png. And then next I'm going to describe the alt attribute, which is going to be kind of the alternative image. If for some reason the image doesn't load, it'll have at least an image that or text that can explain it. Or let's say there's a screen reader that needs to be used, someone who has difficulty seeing things, this would help as well, just if they were using a screen reader. So I'm just going to call this cookie jar. And it's a self-closing tag, therefore it doesn't need a closing tag. So if I were to run this, looks like we have it generated, but it's huge. So we're going to fix that in the CSS. But for now, we're just going to leave it since we're just focusing on the content. So the next step is we're going to describe another section, which I'm going to call plate. And plate is essentially, if we go back to our screenshot, this empty section here. And because it's this empty section here, it looks like it's empty, so I'm just gonna describe an empty section, but include kind of that non-breaking space character, just so, like, if I want it to be an empty div and I define width and height, I want that to be able to actually show up, versus having an empty tag is not going to show up as like an empty section. Then lastly, I'm just going to define the monster section. Monster section. And I'm going to say plate section. So in the monster section, it looks like there is a health bar. And so I'm just going to do another label and call this fullness. What do they call it? Full meter. So I'm going to go back, call this full meter. And then because we can't specifically define kind of, like what is create meaning in this, so it's not a paragraph, it's not a text, it's not like a drop down menu like a select tag, it's not a label. I'm just gonna be using a div that's going to represent the full meter, and I'm gonna give it the ID full meter, close it. And so this has got to act as the container, but then the actual meter, as in what is colored, I'm going to include another div inside here to act as that. And I am also going to do another non-breaking space HTML escape character sequence in here. And then lastly, I'm just going to include the image of the monster, which again, I am specifying an image tag, this source, which is monster.png, and then the alternative is a monster, and there. So finally, I have all these sections tagged, but these are the main content. So I kind of want to specify specifically that it is within, this is the main content, so this is, gotta use the main tag. And so this has gotta semantically divide up your code into two different sections. There's the header sections and then there's the main section. And within the main section, there are subsections: the jar section, the play section, and then finally the monster section. Something I didn't know that's important to know, just to have like clean code, is that whenever you do a opening tag, such as this, where there is no /, you always want to indent on when you do a new line, an indent. But and then when you make the closing tag, you want to backspace or delete that indent and then create that closing tag. So I'm going to run this, and I'm going to open it up in a new tab just to see. Well, this image is huge, and it looks like the monster is not showing up. So, alright, so it looks like what I did was that I forgot to include a quote here, so then it read this entire thing as just like quoted section, or it acted as the div or the ID. So I just placed it back on, and if I were to run it, it looks like the monster is back. So I'm just gonna uncomment this, and finally this is basically the content. I'm gonna go back to the new tab, refresh it, and this should act as the content of the base of your cookie party application. Alright, so moving on to the CSS, we have our HTML code. We're going to actually transform this into what we see here, which is a very stylized look of what's presented here. But before we get started on that, if we navigate to the CSS, it looks like we're going to need to include 2 different fonts that are actually not found in the default browser, or just whatnot. So it needs to be something that's found on fonts.google, or whichever font that you're getting it, whichever font source you're getting it from. I got this from fonts.google, so I'm just got to navigate there. So first I'm going to search up Open Sans, because that's what I want. And so notice there's a lot of styles here. I can't remember specifically what style was used for this screenshot, and I can't really tell, but I'm just going to include the regular, the italic, and then the semi-bold and the bold. So again, it's the regular italic, the semi-bold, and the bold. So make sure to select those, and then it's going to show up on the sidebar, and instead of downloading the family, we're going to choose the embed tab and copy the kind of tag that it gives us that lets us import this font into our website. I'm going to navigate back, go to our index.html, and copy this in our head tag content. So we have the font of Open Sans, and then we also need, let's see, Verdoku 1. So I'm going to navigate back, search browse fonts, exit out of this, search Verdoka 1. So we have, it's the first one that shows up. Select this style, and it looks like it's not showing up, but that's probably because I exited out of the tab, so I'm just going to click here. And it looks like I actually didn't need to do 2 separate links, because what it does is it bundles all of these Google fonts that I want. So I'm actually just going to copy this and replace what I have in the index.html page, because this actually bundles it. Notice how it says Verdoku 1 is the family that I want, and also Open Sans, and specifically what Open Sans. So this one tag has got to kind of group all the fonts that I want. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, we have the fonts that we need. I'm going to link the CSS file. So I'm going to specify the tag link and href, and then again I'm going to specify the path, which is just style.css since the HTML and CSS file is shared. And then I'm going to specify what the relevance of this link is. It's a style sheet. And then finally it's a self-closing tag, so there you go. And so this has got to actually specify, oh, apply this style CSS file to this HTML page. So whatever I put in my style.css will actually show up here. So if I run this, again, nothing happens. It's still the same content. It looks like I still have made a mistake and did the non-breaking space character wrong. So I just need to switch the S and P, run it again, and then it disappears. Alright, great. So let's navigate to the style.css and start styling this. So in the style.css, it gives kind of like a big overview of what is kind of expected or what we kind of want from just the style of this index. So if we look, we want the background colors, corn silk, body font family is Open Sans, and it has that background, and then all these other stylings. So I'm going to start with the background of the entire web page, which I'm going to specify. It's the body, and then say background color is corn silk. Again, so what I just did was I did a selector, which is body here, which is, I'm specifying this tag. I'm selecting that tag, and then I'm doing a curly brace to specify, okay, this section here is going to contain all the styling properties for the body. I specify a property, which is, I say background color is a property, and then the property value, which is corn silk, and then I put a semicolon. Again, this overall is called a rule. This is a selector, but this overall is a rule. Just for technicalities, so I select background dash color is corn silk. If I want to specify the font family, I say the font family property, specify Open Sans. But then I also specify, since Open Sans is a downloaded font, since some browsers don't have that or do not support that font, you need to specify backup fonts. And so I'm just specifying backup fonts to fall back on if the browser that the user is using doesn't support it. So there's Arial, Helvetica, and then sans serif. And these are all fonts that all browsers should have. Yeah, so if I were to run this, as you can see, it does change the color. It did change the color, and it did change the font. And then, so another thing they specify is the headers font family is, so I'm just going to grab all the headers, select all the headers, which is H3, H1, H2, H3, and notice I did a comment separate because I'm saying all of these share these set properties, which is the font family is Fredoka 1, and then falling back on Arial, Helvetica, and then sans serif. As you can see, the images here did change as well. So another thing I'm going to specify is if we go back to our screenshot, it looks like we have like these bolded text. So if we go to that index.html, remember we specified this class called bold. And so I'm just going to add additional classes, which I forgot to add a class to all the bold labels here. Remember, a class, the difference between a class and ID is that a class can be applied to multiple tags versus an ID can only be applied to one tag. So as you can see, I'm using a class called bold on several tags. And the bold class is going to basically give a font weight, if it's a text, of bold. And so again, this is another selector. I'm selecting it by class. That's just a quick review. I'm selecting to select a class. If I hover over it, that kind of helps you. It's an element with a class bold. So to do a specific tag, to select a specific tag, you don't include a dot in the front, but to select a specific class that you specified, you do a dot in the front. So if I were to run this, as you can see, everything that I specified as bold, having the class bold, is bold. And then the next step we'll need to do is to make sure that the images are a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go to style.html and just grab select all the images and specify that the max width is about 200 pixels. Run. Yeah, 200 pixels seems like a good height. So one thing that you should notice is all of the images and just the content in general is in a kind of up and down vertical layout. So that's where the layout, CSS layout, comes in. I want it to actually have a kind of horizontal layout similar to our screenshot here. But before that, I realized there are certain things that I forgot, such as the plate as well as the full meter. So I'm just going to quickly do that. So to style the full meter, I go back to the index.html, and it looks like I gave it the ID full meter, so I'm just going to style that really quickly. I'm going to select that with the hashtag to select an element with the ID full meter, and then I'm going to say it has the border. This is a shortcut that's got to have a width of 1 pixel. It's got to be solid and it's got to be black. And then I'm going to specify that it has a margin, as in the spacing between its border and everything else is got to be maybe like 10 pixels. And then it's going to have a background color of white. So if we were to run this, as you can see, it looks as so. It did have kind of a border radius, like that curved on the edges, so that's the border radius. It's got to be 5 pixels. There you go. And then we're going to actually specify the length of the full meter div that's within it. So that is the background color of light green, as we said before. So if we run it, it's light green. I want it to have the full meter to have a padding of 2 pixels, which is the spacing between the div that's within it and the border. And so if I were to refresh this, notice there is that kind of spacing in between the border and the actual content, which is the div that's within inside it. I'm just going to specify a little bit bigger. There you go, that looks, I mean, honestly, you can't really tell, but when we go further into it, the width of this, notice how the width of the div that's inside is taking up 100%. But if we were to specify 80%, it does go down and kind of acts as like the health bar. So if the width of it is actually going to start at 0, and then we're going to dynamically change the width in JavaScript in the future, and I'll show you how that's done. And then next we'll need to figure out how to do the plate section. So I'm gonna grab the plate section, hashtag plate section, section, specify the background color as white also. Run it and see if it appears. I'm gonna specify the margin as 10 pixels. The border radius, because I do want that curve because it's kind of a plate, to be 10 pixels. And then so if I were to run this, yeah, it looks like it's doing fine. And so now we have that plate section and we have that cookie type, and then we have that monster section. So now this is where we get into the CSS layout of things. Because as I said, this is all in the horizontal or vertical layout, but I want it to be horizontal. So this is a great opportunity to introduce Flexbox, specifically applying Flexbox to main. So just to review, Flexbox is a way to apply CSS layout properties so it can manipulate the layout that we have here. So how do I start using Flexbox in this? I'm going to select the main tag and then I'm going to say display flex. So what that's going to do when I run that, it's got to place everything in that horizontal viewpoint, which is great. But if we go to open it into a new page and then we refresh this, it doesn't take up the entire spot. So what I want to do, and in addition, like the cookie type is next to the cookie jar, which I don't want that. It doesn't look exactly like the picture here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to section it off and specify for each section what I want. So I'm going to say justify content. I'm going to do space between, meaning I want space between each sections. And it's going to be hard to see, so I'm going to switch back and forth with the tab, refreshing this. See, notice how when I did space between, it did that space in between each of the elements. If I were to right click and inspect it and see really what's going on, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. This has the monster section, this has the plate section, and then this has the jar sections. And notice that there's spaces in between it, and so that's what I wanted. But I do actually want kind of the plate to be a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to go back and actually just specify a width of the plate. And I want this to be, let's say, 300 pixels. If I were to run this, it does show up. But how does it show up on a bigger screen? Okay, 300 pixels is okay. I'm going to ramp it up and do 500 pixels. Press run, go back, refresh. Okay, that looks great. Maybe space between wasn't the best. Let's do space around. Go back here to see. Yeah, space around is much more better just because of the fact we get like a lot fuller of the. We have spacing also in between just like the left and rightmost sections, so that looks a lot nicer. I'm also going to specify kind of the width of all the sections to be at least like a specific width, which is the base width. I'm going to specify at least it's got to be 300 pixels at least. We go back here. As you can see, it does specify at least like 300 pixels for each. Actually, let's specify 400. Go back here. And then there you go. And then I'm going to actually also include that each section has like a margin of at least 20 pixels. If I were to run this, there are that spacing in between. So, what is next? So one thing that we forgot is probably just maybe the header needs to be aligned to the center, and then also the cookie type and the cookie jar needs to be actually sitting on top of each other. And I do actually want this to be, I do want the image to be centered within the section. So let's go back and figure out how to do that. I'm going to go to the body and specify text align is center. Text align center. Run. Go back here. So that's aligning everything there. If I go back to the image just to compare, it looks like I didn't, full meters is actually not text align center. So if I want to specify that, I actually should move the text align center property just to say that the header, everything in the header should be text align center. So if I were to run this, it's center, the full meter is center as well. And then now we need to fix the cookie jar scenario. So if we go back, the problem was if we go to our index.html, first of all, so I'm gonna again use Flexbox, but instead I'm gonna add a div. So when I apply the jar Flexbox property to the jar.sections, it recognizes that these two, it'll be kind of manipulating only 2 items versus 3 items. If that kind of confuses you, I would reference back the CSS layout and especially review Flexbox Froggy because it is very complicated. And so now I'm going to navigate back to here and then add another CSS property, which is hashtag, what is this section? It is the jar section. And then add that display flex property. So if I were to refresh this, it does make it kind of weird. So I'm just gotta specify the flex direction since I want it to be vertical instead of horizontal. So it is column. I run it. And then bam. Looks like it's here. But it's kind of missing, like I want this to be in the center. It seems too far left. So to fix that again, what I'm gonna say is justify content, because these are all elements within the jar sections. I can just call justify content and say center, and then it's gotta horizontally center it. You can't really tell here, but if I go back here and refresh this, all right, so it actually did justify content center but horizontally, but I want to do it vertically as well, or it did center it vertically. So it did center, justify content did center it, but it centered it vertically. If I want to do it horizontally, I'm gonna do align items as center and run that. Go back here, refresh. And it did vertically align that as well. So it looks like this was placed as centered as well, just because I believe the flex direction kind of messes up with the horizontal and vertical direction. So it's when it's a column, justify content is going to manipulate kind of the up and down, the vertical alignment versus align and it's got to manipulate the horizontal. From what is seen here, that might not be every case. I tend to just play around with this, but I also kind of want this to be centered as well, so I'm just gonna kind of do the same thing as I did here. Go to index.html, create a div that encompasses the label, and so I did want to kind of create that up and down moment, so I created a div here to kind of, again, make it so that there's only 2 elements that are direct children of the monster section, so it's easier to manipulate what's going on here. Yeah, so we have that, go back, and then I'm just gotta apply kind of the same thing, the same elements here, but to monster section. So just gotta press comma, then run. We go back here. The monster is in the center, but the full meter is kind of in a weird place. So to do that, to fix that, I'm just gonna actually select the first div here. So I'm gonna grab the ID, do this arrow, which signifies what's directly inside of the monster section. So basically, if I go back to the index.html, if I click section, I'm selecting the element that's directly inside, the div that's directly inside the section, so this entire section here, instead of all the divs within here. So just to clarify, this arrow is saying it's directly inside. So if I were to specify that, notice that this is what's gonna show up. And then I'm gonna say the align cells, because I'm just manipulating one section. I'm gonna say flex start, which is, I want it to be at the beginning. If I were to run this, it does move that from the center to the start, but the full meter is not really extending the entire section, so I'm gonna specify the width is 100%. And then if I go back here, it does show the full meter as taking up the entire width there. And we have our monster in the middle there. So there are 2 more things that we'll need to code in the CSS. We'll need to code a class called cookie that's going to be the class that's going to style the cookie images that are generated in the plate. So I'm just going to specify a class called cookie and say the max width is, say, 100 pixels. Let's see if that's correct. I'm just going to do an example image in the index.html to see if that works. I'm going to keep that there and say an image, src. I'm going to choose a random cookie. Let's see. Let's do M&M. M&M.png. I'll do a cookie and run. That looks a little big. Oh wait, I didn't include the class, so let me include the class cookie. If I were to run this, then go back here. Yeah, so that looks a little big, and there isn't really any padding, so I do want to include padding. So if I go to the style.css, I'm going to say actually 50, it's half of that size. Include kind of margins, which is 10 pixels. and see how that looks. Yeah, so that's a little bit more my style. You can manipulate it and choose for it to be bigger or smaller. I think it just looks nicer that size. With when there's multiple cookies, like it is overflowing the plate, I don't want it to just like I'll show you what happens when we add another image into this. Let's see. And if I were to refresh this, it does do like a vertical line, but if it does extend the maximum of this, maximum of this section, I do want it to kind of wrap around. So I'm just gonna do a CSS layout again. So if I go to style.css, I'm gonna say plate section. Let me double check if I specified a plate section. Okay, it's here. So I don't need to specify this again. And say display flex again. But I want all the contents within it to have like a flex wrap. So if it does extend, I'll just wrap. So if I were to run this, and then refresh, it kind of extends the entire page, which I don't want it to do. So I'm just gonna say the max width is 50, but then the max height is also 50 pixels. So when I run it and refresh this, as you can see, it is back to not stretching the entire box or section, but it has its own max height and width. So that's the end of the CSS. Lastly, we're going to navigate to the JavaScript, and I'll see you there. Alright, now we're going to start incorporating JavaScript into this cookie party application. But before we start, let's first remove the cookie here, the cookie images here. Rerun that, make sure it's clear, there's no cookies in there. And then now we are going to navigate to the cookie-party JavaScript, and it has all the instructions that we need to make it a fully functioning application. So the first step is we want to make sure that when the Windows/browser loads, it generates the drop-down menu with options, add an on-change event listener for the drop-down menu, and add an on-click event listener for the cookie jar. So I'm just going to copy what these variables are here below, 24 to 34, and kind of move that up here so we can see what these variables are. So we have an object here that represents the types of cookies that the user can choose from, and then how much they fill up Cookie Monster. So we have the key as the type of cookie, and then the values of each key to represent how much they fill up the Cookie Monster. And then we have a variable that determines what cookie is selected. So to start completing the first step, I'm going to do window.add event listener, because it listens to whether or not the function has loaded. I'm going to declare a anonymous function, which, if you remember, is a function without a name, or function without a name. So what this has got to do is got to listen for whether or not the window has loaded. Because, for example, if I were to navigate back to my index.html page, I could place my link or script tag that links my JavaScript to my HTML in the head. If I do that, again, what that's got to do is that it's going to run all of the code in the JavaScript before the entire page has loaded. So because of that, if I were to place it in the head, the script tag here, let me write out the script tag so you can see what I mean. If I were to script tag and then say the source is cookie or cookie-party.js script. If I were to load this here, basically what's got to happen is the JavaScript is going to run all the code automatically without acknowledging, hey, none of this content is actually loaded, but I'm just going to run this anyways because I don't realize that the browser has loaded or not. So this event listener called load for window makes sure that the window is loaded before it runs a specific chunk of code. An easier way to kind of prevent that and not need a window event listener is to move actually the JavaScript to the end of the body tag. And then another thing that we're going to add in the script is also a helper function.js. And so this is going to contain code that's a little bit more complex. And so such as like calculating hunger here, which kind of calculates, which given a cookie, it calculates what the full meter bar should be. And then it also calculates, it also gives you kind of helper functions where you don't need to write document.getElement by ID. You just have to call this function using the $sign or a QS if you were query selector, or QSA giving a selector document which will return the results of document.querySelectorAll. So these are optional helper functions that you can use throughout the cookie-party.js, but I'm just gonna write it all out so it's just easier for you to understand what's really going on. Going back to cookie-party, it says generate the drop-down menu with options. So first, what I'm going to do is grab all the options. So let cookie options, I'm declare a variable called cookie options, and then I'm gonna call this variable called, or this function called object keys, and pass in cookies. And so what this has got to do is, because the variable cookies is an object, and I want to, and all of the keys here are the types of cookies that a user can select, I want to first grab all the keys of the objects. So this function here is saying, oh, for an object, I'm going to call this function keys and pass in the object that I want an array of keys for. So what this has got to return is an array that has burnt, broccoli, M&M, chocolate, snickerdoodle, and fudge. Essentially an array of the keys that exist there already. And then I'll scroll up. And so I have the cookie options, and now what I want to do is generate the drop-down menu with options. So I have an array, and for each string within the array, I want to create an option DOM element, and attach it to the select drop-down menu here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first grab the drop-down object. So I'm going to call document.querySelector and then say select, because this is the only drop-down menu that exists in this entire application. And then what I'm going to call is declare a for loop. So let I equal 0, I is cookie options dot length, because this is an array, remember. I can call dot length to say I want it to run until it is until it is the cookie options dot length size of this array. And then I'm going to increment it, specify the curly braces, and then say I'm going to create a option. So say an option document, call document.create element and call it an option, and say that the option dot text content is equal to cookie options I, and say that the options dot value, as in the value of this DOM element, is also going to be equal to cookie options I. And then lastly, I'm going to append options, so to the drop down that's already exists on the page. So I'm going to say drop down append child and say option. So if I were to run this, notice that I've attached all the option elements into the select, so it now contains all of the cookie options. And then the next step, as it says here, is add an on-change event listener for the drop-down menu. So I've generated the options here, and then now I'm going to define an add event listener for the drop-down menu. So I say drop-down menu dot add event listener, say on change. So it's saying when the value of this select statement changes. That's why we needed to specify value here. I want it to call this function, which is also, I'm going to say another anonymous function, and say this is going to, and then it's got to have a parameter event. Remember that when an event occurs, and so this function is called, automatically it's got to pass in an event parameter. And the event parameter is going to contain a lot of information about the event. Like that had just happened, all the events that happened on the page. And so we actually want to specify, if I were to console.log this, and then run, and then I got to open this into a separate tab. I got to right click and inspect. Got the console, and then change the values of it. Notice what's returned or is or that's logging out is an events object, and is containing a lot of information that contains kind of what is the element of what event actually occurred and by whom, by which element. And so if I want to access the actual element of this that has the event occurred, I do event.target, and then I am going to say so what is returned here is actually the select statement. If I go back, refresh this, as you can see, it returns that DOM element. And so I actually want to know what the value of this is so I can assign it to a variable. So remember, this part is got to be a DOM element, which is the select tag, and this has got to give me the value of the select or the drop-down menu of like what the current value is. So I'm going to transfer this code. Instead of a console.log, it's got to reassign selected cookie to equal the event.target.value. And then what we are going to do next is add an on-click event listener for cookie jar. And what this is, that essentially that when it is clicked on, calls the function generate cookie. So next we're going to create another add event listener. So I'm going to grab or select the cookie jar. So I'm going to say document.getElement. Actually, let's double check the index and see what would be the most ideal. So the cookie jar doesn't have a ID actually, so I'm going to use a query selector. So I'm going to go back here and say instead document.querySelector is equal to hashtag cookie jar section. Let's double check that. Yes, so it's called jar section. Jar section, and then the image of that. So that's got to select this image here, and I want to say cookie jar dot add event listener. That whenever it's clicked, it's going to run the generate cookie function, which we haven't defined yet, which is in the next step. So this is essentially the first step. This chunk of code here defines or generates the options for the DOM element select. This chunk of code here changes whenever specifies that when the dropdown value is changed. Let's say I click here and change the value. This is changing the value. It calls this function, reassigning the selected cookie variable to be equal what the value of the select statement is. And then lastly, I define the add event listener for the cookie jar here. So the next step is defining the function generate cookie. So again, to define a function, I use the keyword function generate cookie, and then it says call generate cookie that creates the selected cookie DOM element and attaches it to the plate. Make sure the cookie has the following traits: is an image tag, alt attribute containing the type of cookie it is, contains the class cookie, and then something I forgot is contains the src of the selected type cookie. So what's unique about this is if you look at the images, broccoli burnt chocolate.png, most of the images file names match up with the file names here. So really you just need to use kind of what the value of the selected cookie is and just add a .png. So going back to the generate cookies function, as it says, I'm going to first say let cookie is equal document.createElement, and then that's got to be an image. I'm got to say that the image alt tag is equal to the selected cookie value, and then I'm going to say the cookie's source tag is also to the same value as selected cookie, but it's got to contain .png, and also because it's the pathway, again, I am just got to do image / this. It's got to contain the class cookie, and so remember to add anything to the class. I call class list.add cookie, And then we are going to append the cookie to the cookie jar. So first I'm going to select the parent, which is the plate. So I'm going to say plate is equals to document dot query selector, navigate back here, navigate to the index.html, and it says the ID is called plate section. So I grab plate section, go to cookieparty.js, and say hashtag plate section. Again, I use query selector, but you could have used get element by ID as well, because I'm only selecting it by the ID. And then so I am going to append it to this. This is the parent, append child, and then say cookie. So if we were to run this and check to see if it works, gotta say broccoli. Notice it does append it, M&M, chocolate, snickerdoodle, fudge, and lastly, a burnt cookie. So as you can see, it's really adding a lot of elements here, but when I click on it, nothing really seems to happen. So that's where you need to add an event listener to each cookie as well. So before we actually add event listener, actually let's add an event listener here. I'm gonna say cookie dot add event listener. Whenever it's clicked on, I want to call the monster eat function, which is what we're going to define in step 3. Alright, so I'm going to call a function, say monster eat, and it's going to contain the parameter cookie. And so cookie is also, you can name this event, but again, this is whenever you define a add event listener, whenever this function is called, it's automatically gotta pass a parameter that contains a lot of the information about the event. I just called it cookie, the parameter cookie in this instance, but it can be called event. Event is more semantically correct because that's what it's an object containing information about the event, but cookies is just a different variable name. So what I want to do is I want to say cookie.target, and so calling this code is gotta give me back the specific cookie here, image that was clicked on, and then I'm going to remove it because that's the way that you remove a DOM element. One thing that I forgot to mention is we also need to define the class list and add a class that is also the type of cookie that there is. So this is just gotta give an additional class to each cookie depending on what type of cookie it is. That will help with when the calculate hunger function is called. So what I'm gonna do is kind of refactor this so it kind of makes a little bit more sense. So I'm gonna say let targeted cookie equals cookie dot target, and then say I'm just gonna replace this here. I gotta remove it from the DOM or the HTML page, and then I am going to call calculate hunger function and then pass in the targeted cookie element. And so you might be wondering how you can actually call the calculate hunger function when you haven't really defined it in the cookie-party.js. Well, the reason why you can is if we navigate back to our index.html page, notice how the order of the script is. So in the script, helper-function.js is first, before the cookie party. And so that is really important because that means that this JavaScript file is got to run first. And so when it runs first, as you can see, it's defining all these functions. And then cookie-party is got to run second because code is run sequentially. And so when that happens, at this point in cookie-party.js, all the functions that existed in the helper-function.js exist here. So that's how we can use this function and kind of how you can clean up your code if you want. So I'm gonna run this. Alright, sorry about that. I had to make a few adjustments to the code, and so you might not see exactly what I see for previously in the code. So I changed some few things, like adjusted some comments, and adjusted some things in the helper-function, but for you it should be updated. The last thing that we just need to do is we need to first select the div that is within the full meter ID element. And so I just selected it here. And then I assign the full meters width to equal the results that are returned from calculate hunger after passing in the targeted cookie. And so if I were to run this, I select a cookie, generate it, and then click. Notice that now the full meter bar is increasing depending on what type of cookie it is, or decreasing. And that is essentially cookie party. There is an challenge option, so check it out if you'd want to do that. It's just a very simple one that kind of pops up a image to say to the user, oh, the monster is full now. It'll just pop up this image here. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope this helps you with your project or if it was fun to do.